The smell of antiseptic and cheap cigars choked me. I was 16 years old, bleeding and tied to a gurney in a basement clinic in Tijuana. The room was dark, lit only by a single flickering bulb that made the peeling green paint on the walls look like rotting skin. Through the thick haze of anesthesia, my head spinning, I heard 3 distinct cries. They were high, sharp, and full of life. My Bobbies, my sons. "Let me hold them," I rasped, my throat feeling like it was filled with dry sand. I reached out with a trembling hand, trying to find the strength to sit up. Instead of the warm weight of my children, I felt nothing but cold air. My mother, Arden, stood at the foot of the bed. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at the tears streaming down my face. She was looking at a man in a white suit who stood in the shadows. He was known only as the Baron. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like a shark in human skin. He slid a black briefcase across the metal table. The sound of it dragging made my skin crawl. Arden opened the briefcase. I saw the stacks of cash and a thick paper that I later learned was the deed to our family estate. "Done," she said. Her voice was as cold as ice. She signaled the nurse to hand my 3 screaming sons to the Baron's bodyguards. "No," I screamed, tearing at the leather restraints on my wrists. "Mom, please, they're mine, don't let him take them." Arden leaned over me, her eyes dead and flat. She didn't look like my mother anymore. She looked like a stranger. "They are dead, Alara," she whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint and lies. "That's what we're telling the world. You're just a child, you'll forget. This saves the family name. This pays the debt." The heavy steel door slammed shut, silencing their cries. My name is Alara, and that was the last time I saw my sons until they came back to burn the world down. 20 years passed like a slow, painful dream. I was still living in Arden's massive estate, but I wasn't a daughter. I was the unpaid assistant, which was just a fancy way of saying I was a servant who didn't get a paycheck. Arden had spent 2 decades telling everyone a tragic story. She told the world that my Bobbies were stillborn and that the trauma had made me fragile and mentally unstable. She used that lie to keep me under her thumb, making everyone think I needed her protection. I spent my days scrubbing the floors of the very estate my sons were sold to save. Every time I polished the marble, I thought of the Baron's briefcase. Every time I dusted the expensive portraits, I thought of the cries I had heard in that basement. "Alara, move faster. You are so slow," my younger sister, Romilly, snapped. She was the family's golden ticket, the beautiful one Arden had poured all her stolen money into. Romilly walked past me and kicked my shin under the table. I winced but didn't say anything. "My engagement party starts in an hour," Romilly continued, checking her reflection in a gold-framed mirror. "The champagne tower isn't stacked and the flowers look limp. Try to be useful for once, even if your brain is broken." I swallowed my pride, as I had done every day for 2 decades. I knelt on the floor and began stacking the delicate crystal glasses. My knees ached, and my heart felt heavy, but I kept my head down. Arden had convinced me for years that I was lucky she kept me around. I believed I was mourning ghosts. I had no idea that my ghosts were growing into wolves, and they were finally hunting their way home. The ballroom was packed with the city's elite. It was a sea of silk, diamonds, and fake smiles. Romilly was marrying Thayer, a junior executive at a major tech firm. He was rich enough to keep Arden in the lifestyle she loved, and that was all that mattered. Arden was holding court in the center of the room, wearing a diamond necklace she had bought with the allowance she took from the estate funds that were supposed to be mine. I was wearing a plain black dress that made me look like part of the shadows. I held a clipboard, standing near the kitchen door to make sure the catering staff didn't miss a beat. I was the ghost at the feast, the woman who did all the work while others took all the credit. Arden stood up and tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room went quiet. "To my beautiful daughter, Romilly," she toasted, her voice full of fake warmth. "The light of my life, the only one who has never disappointed me. You represent the Larkin family legacy of strength and purity." The crowd laughed and clapped. I looked down at my worn shoes, feeling the familiar sting of tears in my eyes. 20 years of being called a disappointment. 20 years of being told my children were dead because of my weakness. I watched Arden smile at the cameras, her face a mask of perfect motherhood. She had used me to pay her gambling debts, and then she had used the rest of my life to play the role of a grieving, supportive mother. But as she raised her glass for a final sip, the air in the room suddenly changed. It became heavy and cold, as if a storm had just walked through the front door. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom were kicked open with a sound like a gunshot. The music stopped instantly. The expensive string quartet froze, their bows hovering over the strings. Security guards tried to intervene, rushing toward the entrance, but they were effortlessly tossed aside. A wall of men in black tactical gear moved in first, clearing a path like a private army. Then, through the center of the chaos, walked 3 men. The room went completely silent. These weren't just men, they were giants. They were identical triplets, tall and broad-shouldered, with faces that looked like they had been carved from granite. They had cold, predatory eyes that scanned the room with terrifying precision. They wore bespoke Italian suits that cost more than the entire wedding budget combined. They radiated power, the kind of dangerous, unchecked power that made the billionaires in the room look like children. They didn't look at the decorations. They didn't look at the food. They walked right past Thayer, who stood there with his mouth open. They walked right past Romilly, who clutched her pearls in fear. They headed straight for the head table. Arden stood frozen, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. She looked like she was seeing ghosts. I stood by the kitchen door, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was something about the way they moved, something about the shape of their jaws that made my breath catch in my throat. I didn't know who they were, but my soul felt like it was waking up from a 20-year sleep. Arden's hand shook so violently that her champagne glass finally slipped. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound echoing like a bell. She recognized their eyes. I saw the blood drain from her face, leaving her looking old and withered for the first time in her life. She saw the eyes she thought she had buried in Mexico 20 years ago. The leader of the 3 men, a man with a thin, jagged scar through his left eyebrow, stopped directly in front of me. I was still clutching my clipboard, trying to merge with the wall. The entire room held its breath. The elite guests whispered, wondering if these dangerous men were going to attack the help. Instead, the man with the scar, Atlas, did something that made the room gasp. He dropped to one knee. Behind him, the other 2 brothers followed his lead, kneeling in perfect unison on the hard floor. Atlas reached out and took my trembling hand in his. His skin was warm, and his grip was like iron, yet incredibly gentle. He pressed my hand to his forehead, a gesture of deep, ancient respect. "Hello, Mother," he said. His voice was deep and booming, carrying through the silent hall and straight into the microphone on the nearby table. Every guest heard it. Every camera recorded it. I couldn't breathe. I looked down at the 3 of them, Atlas, Knox, and Calder. They weren't bobbies anymore. They were the kings I had heard about on the news, the tycoons who had recently taken over the city's shipping and tech industries. "We're late," Atlas continued, looking up at me with eyes that were exactly like mine. "But we're here to collect, and we're starting with you." "Mother," Romilly shrieked, her voice high and annoying. "Ilara, what is going on? Do you know these intruders? Security, get them out of here." The second brother, Knox, stood up slowly. He turned his head to look at Romilly. He didn't say a single word. He just stared at her with a look of such cold, focused intensity that she actually took a step back, tripping over her own silk train. She went silent, her mouth hanging open in fear. The third brother, Calder, stood up and unhooked a velvet rope that had been separating the guests from the VIP area. He tossed it aside like it was trash. "We are leaving." Atlas told me gently. He didn't look at Arden. He didn't look at the crowd. He only looked at me. "You don't work here anymore, Mother. You don't serve these people." I can't," I whispered, my voice shaking. I looked over at Arden, who was leaning against the table for support. "She has my legal papers. She says I'm sick. She says I have to stay here for my own safety." Atlas let out a dark, short laugh. It was a terrifying sound. "She has papers. We have the city's largest law firm on retainer. Your papers are being voided as we speak." "You're not sick," Calder added, stepping closer. "You were just trapped, but the cage is open now." They flanked me, creating a human shield of muscle and expensive wool. They walked me right out the front doors of the ballroom, through the center of the crowd. I didn't look back, but I could hear Arden behind us, hyperventilating and screaming for someone to do something. Nobody moved. They were too busy watching the kings take their queen. They took me to the Obsidian Tower, the tallest building in the city. It was a monolith of black glass that seemed to touch the stars. We took a private elevator to the penthouse. When the doors opened, I gasped. The space was huge, filled with modern art and windows that showed the entire city glowing below. "We own the building," Calder explained casually as he took my plain coat and handed it to a silent maid. "Actually, we own the entire block. It was easier for security purposes." They sat me down on a velvet sofa that felt softer than anything I had ever touched. They brought me tea and sat in chairs around me. For the first time, I got a good look at them. They were identical, yet different. Atlas had the scar and a look of command. Knox had a mischievous spark in his eyes, though it was hidden behind a wall of hardness. Calder seemed like the quietest, the one who watched everything. "The Baron didn't kill us," Atlas began, his voice low. "He was a monster, but he saw value in us. He raised us to be his enforcers. He wanted us to be the hands that did his dirty work." "But he made a mistake," Knox interrupted, a sharp grin on his face. "He forgot to check how much we were learning. We weren't just muscle, we were sponges. We learned how he moved money, how he bribed officials, and how he crushed rivals." "At 18, we staged a coup," Calder said. "We took over his operations in a single night. Then, we spent the next 2 years legitimizing the businesses, cutting out the rot, and building Triad Corp. We became the kings so we could have the power to find the woman who was forced to give us up." "We knew you were alive," Atlas said, taking my hand again. "And we knew what she did to you. We've spent the last 2 years watching, waiting, and buying up everything Arden Larkin loves." I woke up the next morning in a bedroom larger than the apartment I used to share with the cleaning supplies. The sheets were pure silk, and for the first time in 20 years, I hadn't woken up to the sound of Arden's bell ringing for her morning coffee. A private chef brought me breakfast on a silver tray, real food, not the leftovers I was used to eating in the kitchen. I turned on the massive TV on the wall. The news was exploding. "Mystery Tycoon's crash socialite wedding," the headlines screamed. "Kings claim to be secret sons of reclusive heiress Alara Larkin." There were videos of them kneeling before me, played over and over again. Then the screen showed Arden. She was standing on the steps of the estate, wearing dark sunglasses and a black veil, looking like a grieving widow. "My daughter has been abducted," she wailed to the reporters. "These dangerous men are using her to get to my family's fortune. Alara is mentally fragile. She doesn't know what she's doing. I am calling on the police to bring her home." Panic seized me. I dropped my fork. "We need to go back," I said as Atlas and Knox walked into the room. "She's going to call the police. She'll tell them I'm a danger to myself. She's done it before." Knox laughed, peeling an apple with a pocket knife. He looked completely unbothered. "Let her call them, Mother. Let her call every officer in the city." "Why?" I asked, my heart racing. "Because Triad Corp acquired the police union's pension fund last month," Atlas explained, sitting at the foot of my bed. "Half the precinct chiefs owe their retirement to us. The police aren't coming for you. In fact, if Arden keeps calling them, they'll probably fine her for wasting their time." I sat back, stunned. The power Arden had used to cage me was being dismantled, piece by piece, by the very boys she had sold to keep her life of luxury. Arden didn't call the police again. Instead, she did what she always did when she was in trouble. She tried to use money to solve her problems. She dressed in her finest furs and went to the regional bank to withdraw a large sum of cash. She needed to hire a PR firm to spin the story and a private security team to rescue me. She walked into the bank with her nose in the air, expecting the red carpet treatment. But when she swiped her black diamond card, the machine turned red. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Larkin," the teller said, sounding genuinely confused. "Your accounts have been flagged. I can't process any withdrawals." "That is impossible," Arden shrieked, slamming her hand on the counter. "Get me the manager immediately." She was ushered into the manager's office. She stomped in, ready to fire whoever was responsible. But when the high-backed leather chair spun around, it wasn't the manager sitting there. It was Atlas. "Withdrawal denied," he said. He looked perfectly at home behind the mahogany desk. He looked like the king he was. "What are you doing here?" Arden gasped, clutching her bag. "How did you get into this office?" "Triad Corp quietly acquired this bank at 8 o'clock this morning," Atlas said, leaning forward. "We own your mortgage, Arden. We own your credit lines. And we've noticed something interesting. You're 3 months behind on the estate's property taxes." I had expenses," Arden stammered. "I don't care about your expenses," Atlas said, his voice dropping an octave. "We are calling the loan on the estate. Pay the full balance by Friday or we foreclose. You have 4 days to find $5 million. I wonder who would lend money to a woman who sells her own grandsons." Arden turned and fled the office, her heels clicking frantically on the marble floor. The hunt was officially on. While Atlas handled the money, Calder was handling the family connections. Romilly's fiancé, Thayer, was sitting in his office at Vanguard Tech. He was a man who cared about 2 things, status and his future career. He thought marrying a Larkin was his golden ticket. The door to his office opened, and Calder walked in. He didn't knock. He just sat on the edge of Thayer's desk and started playing with a high-end tablet. "Who are you?" Thayer asked, trying to look important. "You can't just walk in here." "I'm your new boss," Calder said without looking up. "Vanguard Tech was just purchased by a shell company I control. You can check your email. The announcement went out 10 minutes ago." Thayer's face went pale. He checked his computer and his hands started to shake. I see. Well, sir, I'm looking forward to working with you." "I'm not," Calder said, finally looking him in the eye. "I don't like my employees marrying into families that abuse my mother. I don't like people who stand by and watch a woman be treated like a slave just so they can get a piece of a dying estate." "Sir, I didn't know." "You knew enough," Calder interrupted. "Now you have a choice. You can keep your job, your stock options, and your very bright future. Or you can marry Romilly Larkin. If you choose the girl, you are fired today, and I will make sure no firm in this city ever looks at your resume again. You have 60 seconds. Thayer didn't even need 10. He picked up his phone and sent a text message to Romilly, breaking off the engagement and blocking her number. He looked at Calder with a pathetic, hopeful smile. "Good choice," Calder said, standing up. "Now get back to work. You're behind on your quarterly reports." It was my 36th birthday. For the last 20 years, I had spent this day in my room, crying over the 3 sons I thought were dead. Usually, Arden didn't even acknowledge the day, or if she did, she would give me an extra list of chores to keep my mind off things. This year was different. Knox came to the penthouse and told me to get in the car. He drove me to Arden's estate. We didn't go inside. We parked across the street and watched. A massive industrial delivery truck was backed up onto the front lawn. Men were jumping out and dumping piles of trash onto the grass. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't trash. It was a mountain of luxury goods. There were fur coats, expensive oil paintings, marble statues, and designer jewelry boxes. I recognized every item. These were the things Arden had bought for herself over the years with the money she got from the Baron. The blood money. She used to rebuild her life after selling my boys. "What are they doing?" I asked, watching the pile grow. "We repossessed them," Knox said, leaning against the steering wheel with a satisfied smirk. "We found the original receipts. Since these were bought using funds from an illegal transaction involving minors, they are technically the property of the victims. Since we don't want her junk, we're giving it back to the street." Arden appeared at the front window. She was screaming, her face pressed against the glass, but the windows were soundproof. She looked small and desperate as her treasures were tossed into the mud. "We're not just taking her money, Mother," Knox said, his voice suddenly very serious. "We're taking her identity. We're taking every single thing she used to prove she was better than you." I watched as a heavy stone fountain she loved was dumped onto the lawn, shattering into pieces. For the first time, I didn't feel sad. I felt a strange sense of weight leaving my shoulders. The pressure was working. Arden and Romilly were starting to crack. We decided it was time to see them face to face. We sent a formal invitation to the penthouse for a dinner of terms. We told them it was their one chance to discuss a settlement before the foreclosure. They arrived an hour later, dressed as if they were still the queens of the city. Arden wore a vintage Chanel suit and enough pearls to sink a ship. Romilly wore a cocktail dress and thick makeup to hide the fact that she had been crying over Thayer. They walked in with their noses in the air, trying to pretend they weren't terrified. "I see you've done quite well for yourselves," Arden said, sitting down at the massive dining table and looking at Atlas. "The Baron clearly gave you an education. I suppose I should be thanked. I made the right choice, giving you a better life than a 16-year-old girl ever could have." The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Atlas didn't blink. Knox stopped smiling. Calder placed his hands flat on the table. "You didn't give us a better life," Atlas said, his voice like a grinding stone. "You sold us to a criminal. We survived because we were strong, not because you were kind. You traded our childhoods for a deed to a house." "It was for the family," Arden snapped. "The Larkins have a name to protect." "The Larkin name is a joke," Knox said. "And as for the family, the only family in this room is sitting on this side of the table." I sat at the head of the table, wearing a dress that cost more than their car. I looked at the woman who had spent 20 years telling me I was nothing. I didn't feel small anymore. I felt like the mother of kings. "The dinner is served," I said, signaling the waitstaff. The waiters moved in perfect silence. They placed large, silver-domed cloches in front of Arden and Romilly. Arden looked hopeful for a moment, thinking we were going to offer her a bridge to her old life. "Finally," Arden muttered, "I'm starving. This stress is terrible for my digestion." I signaled the waiters. In unison, they lifted the silver lids, but there was no food underneath. On Arden's plate was a single piece of paper, a photocopy of the original gambling debt receipt from 20 years ago, detailing the $5 million she owed the Baron. Next to it was a list of every bank account she had ever used to hide the money. On Romilly's plate was a stack of termination letters. She had been kicked out of the junior league, the yacht club, and every exclusive social circle in the city. Her friends had all seen the videos of the wedding. "What is this?" Romilly shrieked, throwing the papers onto the floor. "Where is the stake? Where are the terms?" "These are the terms," I said, my voice finally finding its full strength. It didn't shake. It didn't waver. "Eat up, Mother. It's exactly what you've been feeding me for 20 years. It's the truth." "You think you've won?" Arden hissed, leaning across the table. "You're still just a girl who couldn't keep her secrets. I am the one who holds the history of this family." "You hold nothing," Atlas said. He stood up and the brothers stood with him. "The estate goes to auction on Friday. You have 48 hours to pack your bags. We aren't here to negotiate, Arden. We're here to watch you fall." "Get out," I added. They stood up, sputtering and red-faced, and were escorted to the elevator by the security team. As the doors closed, I finally took a deep breath. The dinner was over, but the hunger for justice was just getting started. Romilly was the first to try a different tactic. She was younger and more desperate. She realized that Thayer wasn't coming back and her mother's money was drying up. She thought she could use her charm on the lost nephews. A few hours after the disastrous dinner, Romilly showed up at the Obsidian Tower alone. She managed to talk her way past the lobby by claiming she had vital information for her nephews. Knox met her in the lounge. I watched from the upper balcony, hidden by the shadows. Romilly walked up to Knox and touched his arm, her eyes wide and watery. "You know, Knox," she purred, her voice sweet and fake. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. The stress of the wedding was just too much, but I always wanted nephews. Alara was always so mean to me, so cold. She never let me be part of your lives. I would have been a cool aunt. I could help you navigate this city's social scene." Knox looked down at her hand on his arm as if it were a cockroach crawling on his expensive suit. He didn't move. He didn't smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wet antiseptic napkin. He slowly used the napkin to wipe the exact spot she had touched, his face full of disgust. "You treated our mother like a slave," Knox said, his voice cold and flat. "I watched the security footage from the house. I saw you kick her. I saw you laugh when she cried. You didn't want nephews, Romilly. You wanted a paycheck." "That's not true." "The only thing you'll ever be to us is a cautionary tale," Knox continued, dropping the napkin onto her shoe. "A story we tell our children about what happens when you value a handbag more than a human soul. Now, get out before I have security carry you to the curb." Romilly turned and ran, her fake tears turning into real ones. She had no one left to charm. Arden wasn't going down without a fight. She went to the local news stations and the tabloids. She did a tell-all interview where she claimed the triplets were imposters. "These men are con artists," Arden cried to the cameras, holding a lace handkerchief. "They found out about my daughter's tragic past and they are using it to steal our ancestral home. They aren't my grandsons. They are thugs from the Baron's old organization. I demand a DNA test. I demand justice for my fragile daughter." The public started to whisper. Some people believed her. "Maybe they are just after the money," the comments section said. Atlas called the news station that same afternoon. "We agree to the test," he said, "but we want it done live. We want the world to see the results at the same time we do." The kings and the matriarch met at a high-end lab. The results were announced 3 hours later on a special live broadcast. The host looked stunned as she read the paper. "The results are in," the host said, her voice shaking slightly. "The 3 men known as the Kings are a 99.9% genetic match to Alara Larkin. They are, beyond any doubt, her biological sons." The crowd in the studio erupted into cheers, but then the host continued. "Furthermore, the test shows a 0% relation to the man known as the Baron. He was never their father." Arden looked like she had been slapped. The cameras zoomed in on her face as she tried to spin it. I had to give them up," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "We were poor. I did it for Alara. I found them a powerful home." "You were poor because you gambled away $5 million, I said, stepping into the frame from off-camera. I looked right into the lens. "And you didn't find them a home. You sold them for a deed." Arden looked trapped. For the first time, the world saw the monster behind the pearls. With the DNA test confirming their identity, the brothers moved to the next phase, the enablers. They knew Arden couldn't have pulled off the stillborn lie alone. They needed the doctor who had signed the fake death certificates. They tracked down Dr. Merrick. 20 years ago, he was a disgraced medic in a basement clinic. Now, he was running a posh, expensive plastic surgery clinic uptown. He had used the Baron's hush money to build a new life of luxury. Calder didn't go to the clinic. He sat in the penthouse and used his skills. He hacked into Dr. Merrick's private servers and released 20 years of illegal medical logs, including the original notes from the night of my C-section. The logs clearly showed 3 healthy male infants delivered, mother conscious, infants removed by Arden Larkin. The news broke while Dr. Merrick was mid-surgery on a famous actress. The police arrived at his clinic 10 minutes later. He was led out in handcuffs, still wearing his surgical scrubs. He didn't even try to deny it. He immediately started talking to the police, hopping for a plea deal. The circle around Arden was tightening. Every person who had helped her hide the truth was falling. She was becoming a pariah in the city she once ruled. People were crossing the street to avoid her. Her favorite boutiques banned her. "The walls are closing in," Atlas said as we watched the arrest on the news. "She thinks she's a queen, but she's just a prisoner in a house she no longer owns." I felt a strange mix of emotions. I had been the one in the cage for so long that it felt surreal to watch the person who put me there finally feel the bars. My sons were doing more than just punishing her. They were erasing her. Friday finally arrived. It was the deadline for the mortgage payment. Arden hadn't found the money. Nobody would lend it to her, and Romilly's friends had all vanished. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the sheriff arrived at the Larkin estate. He wasn't alone. Knox was standing right behind him, wearing a dark suit and a look of cold satisfaction. They walked up to the front door and knocked. When Arden opened it, she looked 20 years older. Her hair wasn't done, and her expensive silk robe was stained. "Mrs. Larkin," the sheriff said, "I have an order of eviction. You have 1 hour to vacate the premises. You may take 1 suitcase of personal clothing. Everything else is under lien." "You can't do this," Romilly screamed from the foyer. She was clutching 3 designer handbags and a fur coat. "This is our home. Where will we go? We have nowhere to go." "I hear the Baron's old basement in Tijuana is vacant," Knox suggested, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "It's a bit damp, but it's within your budget." He stepped forward and took the designer bags out of Romilly's hands. "And these are company property now, Romilly. They were bought with funds diverted from the estate." "You monster," Romilly cried. "I'm not a monster," Knox said, leaning in close. "I'm just the bill you forgot to pay 20 years ago. Now start packing. The locks are being changed at 11. I watched from the car as they were led out of the house. Arden looked like a broken doll. Romilly was sobbing. They were left on the sidewalk with 2 small suitcases, watching as the Larkin Estate sign was taken down and replaced with a foreclosed banner. It was the first time I had ever seen them without their armor of wealth. They looked small. They looked pathetic. Homeless and desperate, with only a few $100s between them, Arden and Romilly were forced to check into a cheap, flickering motel on the edge of town. It was a place that smelled of old cigarettes and despair, the kind of place they used to mock when they drove past. The pressure of the situation finally broke the one thing they had left, their loyalty to each other. On Monday morning, Romilly realized that staying with her mother was a dead end. She saw the writing on the wall. She went to the Central Police Station alone. She requested a meeting with the district attorney and offered to testify against her mother regarding the human trafficking charges. "I'll tell you everything," Romilly promised the detectives, her voice desperate. "I'll tell you about the Baron, the money, and how she used my sister like a slave. I have emails. I have letters. Just give me immunity. Don't let me go to jail." She sat in an interrogation room for 6 hours, pouring out every dark secret Arden had ever kept. She sold out her golden mother for the chance to walk free. That evening, I sat in the penthouse with my sons. We turned on the 6 o'clock news. There was Romilly, her face blurred but her voice unmistakable, giving a televised statement about the crimes of Arden Larkin. Arden was watching from her motel room. We had sent a courier with a small TV just so she wouldn't miss it. I could only imagine the look on her face as she watched her favorite child, the one she had sacrificed my life for, stab her in the back for a plea deal. "The golden child has turned to lead," Calder said, shaking his head. "She learned from the best," I whispered. "Arden taught her that people are just things to be traded. She shouldn't be surprised that Romilly traded her." Arden was cornered, vicious, and completely alone. But a cornered animal is often the most dangerous. Instead of running, she decided to use the legal system one last time. She filed a massive lawsuit against me. She didn't sue for the money or the house. She knew she couldn't win those. Instead, she sued for grandparents' rights. It was a ludicrous, desperate Hail Mary. She claimed that under a specific, ancient state law, she was entitled to court-ordered visitation and financial support from her grandsons because she was the one who facilitated the adoption that had allowed them to become wealthy. "I am the reason they are successful," Arden told her new, bottom-tier lawyer. "If I hadn't given them to the Baron, they would be nothing. I am a victim of my own daughter's greed. I deserve a thank-you fee for my role in their lives." Her lawyer managed to get the case into a preliminary hearing. It was a circus. The media was calling it the trial of the century. "We have to go to court, Mother," Atlas told me. He looked more annoyed than worried. "The judge has to hear the motion. It's a waste of time, but it's the only way to end this legally and publicly." "I'm tired of the cameras, Atlas," I said. "This is the last time," he promised. "We're going to give her exactly what she asked for. We're going to give her her day in court." I looked at my 3 sons. They stood tall, like pillars of stone. I realized then that they weren't just protecting me, They were performing a public execution of Arden's reputation. They wanted the world to see the final nail in her coffin. The courtroom was packed to the rafters. There were more reporters than lawyers. Arden arrived wearing a cheap, borrowed black dress, trying to look like a poor, misunderstood grandmother. She sat at the plaintiff's table, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. When it was her turn to speak, she played the victim perfectly. "Your Honor," she sobbed to the judge. "I was a young grandmother. We were in debt. I was scared. I found those boys a good home with a powerful man. Look at them now. They are kings. They are the most successful men in the city. I did that for them. I gave them their start. And now my daughter, whom I supported for 20 years, is trying to leave me in the street." She turned and smiled at me, a cold, triumphant smile that said I can still win. "I made you, Ilara. You owe me your life. You owe me for your children's success." The judge looked skeptical, but he was bound by the law to listen to the evidence. "Mr. Larkin," the judge said, looking at Atlas, "does the defense have a response to these claims of facilitation?" Atlas stood up. He didn't look at Arden. He looked at the judge. He was calm, his voice steady and powerful. "Your Honor, the plaintiff claims this was a benevolent adoption," Atlas said. "She claims she facilitated our success. However, we have evidence that this wasn't an adoption at all. It was a transaction, a cold-blooded sale of human life." "That's a lie," Arden shrieked from her seat. "We have the evidence," Atlas repeated. He signaled to Calder, who was sitting at a laptop. "Please project the document onto the main screen." The lights in the courtroom dimmed. A massive image flickered onto the screen behind the judge. It was a scanned copy of a yellowed, handwritten document. It was the deed of sale from that basement clinic in Tijuana. It wasn't an adoption paper. It was a commercial contract. At the top, in bold letters, it said, "Asset Transfer Agreement." The courtroom went dead silent as people read the text. It listed the items being exchanged. The deed to the Larkin estate. Forgiveness of gambling debt, $5 million. Delivery of 3 healthy male infants. And there, at the bottom, was the signature. It was Arden Larkin's elegant, flowing handwriting, right next to the Baron's messy scrawl. The gasp in the courtroom was audible. It sounded like a physical wave of shock. One of the reporters actually dropped his camera. The judge looked at the screen, and then he looked at Arden with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He looked like he wanted to wash his hands just from being in the same room as her. "Facilitation," Atlas said, his voice echoing through the silence. "You didn't facilitate our lives, Arden. You sold us like livestock to pay for your mistakes." Arden stood up, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. It was a business arrangement. I saved the family name. I did it for the estate." I stood up then. I didn't wait for my lawyer. I walked to the middle of the floor and looked my mother in the eye. "No, Mother," I said, my voice finally finding its ultimate power. "You sold your own blood to save your vanity. You traded your grandsons for a house, and now the bill is due, in full." I looked back at my 3 sons. "Finish it." Arden's lawyer stood up, looked at the document on the screen, and then looked at his client. He didn't say a word. He just picked up his briefcase, turned around, and walked out of the courtroom. He had resigned on the spot. Arden was left standing alone at the table. She was trembling so hard her pearls were clicking together. "Your Honor, please," she cried, turning back to the judge. "It was 20 years ago, the statute of limitations. You can't punish me for something that happened so long ago." The judge leaned forward, his face like stone. "Mrs. Larkin, the statute of limitations for human trafficking is very specific, and because you fraudulently concealed the crime by claiming the children were stillborn, the clock only started ticking the day they walked into that ballroom." "But I'm an old woman." "You are a criminal," the judge barked. "And this court finds your motion for grandparents' rights to be not only legally baseless but morally repugnant. Not only is this case dismissed with prejudice, but I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution." The courtroom erupted. People were standing on chairs to get a look at the monstrous matriarch. I walked toward the exit, my sons flanking me like a royal guard. As we passed Arden's table, she reached out to grab my arm, her eyes full of a pathetic, desperate light. "Alara, please," she begged. Tell them I loved you." I stopped and looked at her hand on my sleeve. I gently peeled her fingers off, just as Knox had done to Romilly. "The only thing I have to tell you, Mother, is goodbye," I said. "I hope the estate was worth it, because it's the only thing you have left, and even that belongs to me now." The police didn't wait for a warrant. Based on the evidence presented in the civil court and the testimony from Romilly, they moved immediately. As we walked out of the courtroom and into the hallway, the bailiffs were already moving in. They grabbed Arden's arms and pulled them behind her back. The sound of the metal handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. "You can't do this," Arden screamed, her voice echoing through the marble hallway. "I am a Larkin, I am a member of the elite." "Not anymore," a detective said, leading her away. Arden looked around the hallway, her eyes searching for a friendly face. She saw Romilly standing near the elevators. Romilly was wearing a new coat and looking at her phone, completely indifferent to her mother's arrest. "Romilly, help me," Arden cried out. Romilly looked up for a brief second. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She just turned her back on her mother and walked into the elevator. She had moved on to her next survival plan. Arden had finally learned the lesson she had taught us all. In her world, there is no such thing as unconditional love. We walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun. A fleet of black SUVs was waiting for us. The press was swarming, but the private security team kept them back. "It's over, Mother," Atlas said, opening the car door for me. "She's going to spend the rest of her life in a place far worse than that basement in Tijuana." "I know," I said. I looked up at the sky. For the first time in 20 years, the sun didn't feel like it was mocking me. It felt like it was welcoming me home. 1 week later, we returned to the Larkin estate, but we didn't go as guests. We went as the new owners. The house was empty. The furniture had been removed, the blood money luxury items were gone, and the air felt cold and stale. It was no longer a palace of lies. It was just an old, dusty building. I stood in the grand foyer, the place where I had spent thousands of hours scrubbing the marble on my hands and knees. I looked up at the massive oil portrait of Arden that still hung above the marble mantel. In the painting, she looked proud and untouchable. Atlas walked into the room. He was carrying a heavy, industrial sledgehammer. He looked at the portrait, then he looked at me. "Renovations?" he asked with a small, knowing smile. I took the sledgehammer from him. It was heavy, but I felt a surge of strength I didn't know I possessed. I swung the hammer with everything I had. The head of the hammer slammed into the center of the portrait, tearing through the canvas and smashing the gold frame. The painting crashed to the floor in a pile of splinters and torn silk. "Gut it," I said, looking at the empty space on the wall. "Every floor, every wall, every memory. I want this place torn down to the studs." "What are we building?" Knox asked, walking in with Calder. "A sanctuary," I said. "A place for mothers who have no one. A place where no child is ever seen as a debt and no woman is ever treated like a ghost. We're going to use the Larkin fortune to make sure no one ever has to go through what I did." "I like it," Calder said. "We'll call it the Phoenix." I looked at my 3 sons, my kings, my wolves. We were finally building something that wasn't based on a lie. 6 months have passed since the walls of the old estate were torn down. Today is the grand opening of the Phoenix Sanctuary. I am sitting on the wide, sun-drenched terrace of the rebuilt house. It is beautiful now, filled with light, soft colors, and the sound of children laughing in the new garden. It is a place of healing. Atlas, Knox, and Calder are sitting around a large wooden table nearby. They are arguing over a new business project, their voices full of life and energy. They have become the most powerful men in the city, but to me, they are still the 3 boys who came back to save their mother. I pour a cup of tea, my hands steady and calm. I no longer have nightmares about basement clinics or dark briefcases. The past hasn't been forgotten, but it has been defeated. I lost 20 years of their lives. I will never get to see their first steps or hear their first words. I will never know what it was like to hold them as infants. That is the grief I will carry forever. But as Atlas leans over to kiss my cheek, and Knox pours me a glass of wine, and Calder shows me the new security patents he's donating to the sanctuary, I realize that I didn't just lose 20 years. I gained a lifetime of pride. Arden is in a prison cell, surrounded by the walls she built with her own greed. Romilly is working a retail job in another city, forgotten and alone. They have exactly what they traded their souls for, absolutely nothing. I have everything. I have my name back. I have my dignity. And most importantly, I have my sons. My wolves are finally home and the hunt is over. I am no longer the maid. I am the queen of my own life. I take a sip of my tea and look out at the horizon. The sun is setting, but for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the dark.